stop carrying the fire. How to finally let go of resentment. Right now, you are likely carrying a dry, burning restlessness directly behind your ribcage, an exhausting internal heat that comes from replaying the exact evidence of how unfairly you were treated. You lie awake in the deep hours of the night, nursing a fully justified resentment, turning the details over and over as if compiling a silent case against those who crossed your boundaries. This grievance feels like a necessary protection, a shield that proves you were right and they were wrong. Yet the massive internal effort required to keep this fire alive is what is actually scorching your own inner peace. Your mind remains permanently on the defensive, trapped in an endless loop of silent arguments that leaves your chest tight and your throat dry. You are holding on to the live coals of an old betrayal to preserve the truth of your hurt. But the smoke is filling your own lungs, keeping your body braced and your mind unable to access the cool sanctuary of rest. The air in your room has gathered the crisp, refreshing scent of pine needles after rain, the soft texture of damp moss, and the slow, soothing presence of a high forest clearing. Let your body sink directly into the steady, unyielding support of the mattress beneath your shoulder blades, feeling how the ground carries your full weight without asking you to prove your innocence for a single second longer. There is a deep, quiet validation waiting for you in this dark hour, an assurance that your burning irritation is not a sign of a broken spirit, but a natural fatigue from carrying a heavy weight that was never meant to be strapped to your chest. No forced forgiveness will be demanded of your heart during these hours, and your current life requires no resolution of the conflict to remain completely valid, whole, and safe just as it is. You are permitted to let the argument rest without a final verdict tonight. We often imagine that our ongoing resentment is an act of resistance against the person who harmed us, or that if we stop burning with anger, we are somehow condoning their behavior or letting them escape the consequences of their actions. But a surprising, liberating insight from the teachings of the Buddha suggests that our exhaustion comes from a completely different kind of misunderstanding. The mind does not suffer because the past event was painful, but because we are continuously carrying the hot embers of that event inside our own current awareness, choosing to protect the flame to prove the crime occurred. This righteous attachment to our grievances turns our own chest into a smoldering furnace, because we are using our limited current vitality to maintain the ghost of an offense that has already passed. You are punishing your own spirit out of a quiet dread that your pain will be forgotten, forgetting that the real path to freedom is found not in changing the wrongdoer, but in allowing your own heart to cool. It is deeply draining to live your life as a guardian of an old fire, constantly checking the heat of your resentment while your solar plexus absorbs the dry stress of your hypervigilance. Right now, dear friend, you might notice a distinct, rigid tightness locked directly across your diaphragm, or a subtle hot restriction in the muscles of your throat. This physical armor is the direct somatic price of a mind that has been trying to protect its dignity by keeping the evidence hot, hour after hour, treating the natural release of the past as an act of surrender. Maybe you have felt this too, a heavy weariness that makes it impossible to fully receive a peaceful evening, because you are still mentally litigating an unfair interaction that happened seasons ago. We assume that if we can just maintain our anger, we will keep ourselves secure from future harm. But keeping the charcoal basket so close to your ribs only ensures that your own skin is blistered by the heat. In a short while, our journey will lead us to a high, damp forest clearing filled with smoldering earthen pits and the cool touch of night rain on stone, offering a completely fresh way to relate to this burning life. But before we wander up into those misty woods, let us sit softly with the immediate reality of how your body is resting right now. The anticipation of being dismissed or invalidated can feel like a heavy, smoking strap binding your chest, its restriction shortening your breath as you lie perfectly still under the covers. You have monitored this internal boundary for many days, believing that if you allowed your anger to cool into ash without an apology, everything you suffered would be erased. But notice how much energy it takes to keep those coals glowing beneath your blankets. Your stomach has grown hard from the heat, and your awareness is living on the edge of an old wound. Allow a long, unhurried expansion to clear the dry smoke from your lungs, letting the cool forest wind move through your center without any resistance or force. As you let that current pass, notice if there is even a tiny pocket of space where your ribs can loosen completely into the mattress, letting your chest spread out like an unbuckled harness. You do not have to settle the ultimate justice of your life before the sun rises, and you do not need to find an apology from an empty house to prove your readiness for sleep. The cold hearth requires no ongoing flame to justify its space, and the space inside your heart in this exact second is completely open, unburned, and free. There is no requirement to prove your innocence from this quiet bed, and you may let the charcoal basket drop onto the damp path for the night. The heavy identity of being a person who must permanently maintain a wall of resentment is not your permanent nature, because the events that taught you that defense are completely distant, existing now only as a habit of heat inside your muscles. What you are actually carrying is your ongoing effort to keep an old fire alive, a quiet, internal panic that your dignity cannot survive without the protection of your anger. Every time you replay the details of the betrayal to validate your bitterness, or hold your heart back from a simple moment of joy, out of loyalty to your hurt, you add another piece of fuel to a hearth that was meant to grow cold. You are completely permitted to be tired of this constant burning, and you may let the split oak tongs rest on the wet moss tonight. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, letting go of the unspoken arguments and the silent documentations you have been planning behind your eyes for so long. Let the small muscles around your solar plexus relax, releasing the constant, vigilant effort to keep your grievance hot against a horizon that you cannot change. Right now, the high clearing has grown completely dark, and the cold ash needs no guardian, your intervention, or your permission to remain completely quiet. You are safe enough to let the defensive machinery of your thoughts go entirely slack, if it feels right, allowing the embers to die down while the wet forest air carries the last traces of smoke away into the wide night sky. The faint hiss of falling rain meeting hot earth carries a unique, acrid note that lingers long within the deep folds of the mountain hemlocks, high above the low valleys, nestled within a permanently damp clearing where the ground was black from generations of wood splitting, lived a young forest worker named Taran. Taran possessed an extraordinary ability to read the grain of green timber, a steady hand with the felling axe, and an internal memory that retained the sharp sting of old betrayals with an unyielding, rigid sharpness. Seasons ago, a severe misunderstanding among the mountain workers had caused a destructive fire to sweep through the western timberlines, and though Taran was entirely blameless, the village elders had placed the full weight of the negligence upon his shoulders. This unfair accusation left a permanent, smoldering heat locked directly behind his ribs, a restless compulsion to preserve the evidence of his mistreatment, so that his innocence could never be dismissed or forgotten by those who had wronged him. This persistent drive to maintain his grievance led Taran to fashion a small, tightly woven willow basket lined with dried mud, which he filled with active, smoking embers from the original ruins of the disaster. He strapped this heavy embers basket directly inside his coarse hemp tunic, wearing it flat against his chest like a secret shield of proof wherever he walked through the mountain paths. He believed that carrying these live coals was an absolute necessity, a righteous validation that kept the truth of his hurt from being erased by the passage of time. When he sat alone in the quiet evening hours, the thin lines of white wood smoke would rise past his chin, stinging his eyes and dryly clogging his throat as he turned the old conversations over in his mind. The dark willow twigs grew scorched and black against his skin, yet he refused to unbuckle the straps, treating the blistering heat against his chest as a small price to pay to keep his defense intact. As the months stretched into the autumn rains, the habit of guarding the basket became an automated, exhausting vigilance that dominated his nights. He would lie awake on his cedar bench, his diaphragm frozen and his jaw tightly locked as he continuously monitored the embers, terrified that if the fire went entirely cold, the truth of his innocence would dissolve with the ash. The constant, dry warmth under his tunic kept his breathing shallow, and his heart hammered restlessly against the wooden slats as he rehearsed the silent arguments he would one day present to the council. He was so busy keeping the evidence hot that he could no longer feel the refreshing, cool air of the high forest, nor could he participate in the simple, quiet life of the clearing, without his bitterness filtering every word he received. His identity had become entirely bound to the smoking basket, a hot, protective fortress that was slowly consuming his own physical vitality. Deep within the oldest section of the woods, where the mist accumulated in the hollows, lived an old woman known as the Master Ash Shifter. She was a person of immense, grounded stillness, her hands permanently stained gray by decades of clearing dead hearths, her face deeply lined by time but entirely free from the tight, guarded patterns that marked Terran's features. She spent her days turning over dead fuel with her bare palms, handling cold stones and wet charcoal without a single sign of irritation or haste. One evening, when the high forest clearing had grown completely dark beneath a heavy canopy of rain clouds, Terran walked slowly toward her low timber shelter. The heavy willow basket was pressing hard against his breastbone, emitting a sharp, acrid line of smoke that made his breath catch in his throat as he approached her stone hearth. He stood near the low rock wall where she sat, his shoulders hunched tight under the invisible pressure of his accumulated anger. The old woman did not lecture him on the nature of forgiveness, and she did not minimize the deep injustice of the accusation that had started his internal fire seasons ago. She simply reached out with a pair of split oak tongs, using the green, uncharred wood to lift a heavy piece of wet moss from a bucket near her stool. She held the damp moss for a long moment, allowing the water to drip slowly onto the dry earth between them, completely unhurried by the acrid smoke that filled the small room. She looked up at Terran's rigid posture, then placed the simple wooden tongs directly onto the flat stone table that sat between their benches. She did not speak an immediate lesson. She merely reached out her gray palm and gently touched the outer edge of the scorched willow basket that was hidden beneath his tunic. The heat radiating from the mud-lined twigs was intense, dry, and entirely draining to the touch, carrying no light but a persistent, hidden burning that kept the fabric of his clothes permanently singed. The ash shifter looked from the heavy basket to the split oak tongs resting on the stone, then picked up the wooden tool and used it to lift a single cold piece of charcoal from her dead hearth, holding it loosely without absorbing a single trace of its history. Terran sat perfectly still in the dim light of the shelter, his chest tightening as he watched her steady, unburned fingers drop the cold wood into the damp sand. The realization hit his mind with the clean, quiet force of the night wind, breaking through the rigid assumptions he had carried for months. He saw that his frantic effort to maintain the live coals had not altered the minds of the village elders. It had only turned his own chest into an unyielding furnace that was keeping his spirit from ever receiving the cool rain. A long, heavy sigh finally broke from his lips, a slow relaxation that allowed his diaphragm to drop, and his hand moved tentatively toward the heavy leather buckles that bound the smoking basket to his ribs. The dull, acrid heat radiating from that hidden willow basket reveals a profound truth about what takes place inside your own chest. When you lie awake trying to build an absolute case of righteousness against those who crossed your boundaries. When we look deeply into this old story, we find that it does not ask us to become completely passive, unfeeling statues who ignore our past injuries, or pretend that we have no stakes in our emotional dignity. The ancient wisdom was never an instruction to freeze your natural responses, or to treat your tender human history with a forced, artificial numbness. It is a completely different kind of invitation, a quiet realization that the genuine ache of an unfair moment is very different from the exhausting daily struggle of constantly feeding a thick layer of smoldering embers to lock your diaphragm in place. Your internal space is simply an open clearing that has been subjected to occasional heat and smoke, a setting waiting for its proper cooling. The true burden, the heavy work that keeps you from sleeping tonight, is the fierce, ongoing heat your mind applies to your grievance every single hour. We often live with a deep internal craving that disguises itself as an honorable journey of self-preservation. This craving is the desperate, rigid feeling in your solar plexus that insists you must achieve a state of total validation before you can finally allow yourself to drop your defense or be protected from future slight. It is the belief that if you can just preserve the live coals of your resentment perfectly enough, your current existence will finally be secure from dismissal and insulated from the agony of being forgotten as a victim. But when you look closely at this habit, you find that your mind has turned self-protection into a form of slow, internal blistering. You are holding on to an old image of an offensive event with such an intense grip that your own genuine present life is left completely choked, filled with the acrid smoke of your arguments because your spirit is still standing in the ruins of a past year, trying to turn a painful memory into an impenetrable shield. True presence is not about destroying your natural capacity to feel, but about developing the gentle ability to notice a hypervigilant thought without giving it all your strength to fan the next spark of anger. It is the simple, soft awareness that can observe a habit of resentment arising in the mind without mistaking that specific reaction for a permanent definition of the clearing you inhabit. When you allow yourself to perceive an internal irritation as a piece of charcoal resting inside a green oak tool, rather than a total collapse of your personal security, your relation to your history begins to change. The betrayals of your yesterday cannot dictate your peace tonight, unless you lend them your current breath, using your limited energy to maintain a frantic heat that does not belong to the quiet room where you are resting. Consider how much more exhausting an insecurity becomes when you decide it is an active threat you must counter from your bed, rather than just an old log that has already spent its fire in the woods. The great insight of constant change reminds us that nothing in our internal landscape is permanent, not even the deepest patterns of bitterness we believe we have carved into our sense of self. Every conditioned thought is a temporary arrangement of old memories, a pattern that will naturally loosen its grip if you stop applying the dry fuel beneath your ribs to keep the agitation alive. Your suffering has grown larger, not because your true nature is lacking, but because you have been using your desire for absolute vindication to add a secondary artificial distress to a frame that was already trying to rest on its own. You have been treating an inner hearth as a permanent combat zone, acting as both the frantic watchman and the heavy furnace under your own blankets. When we speak of letting go, we are not talking about a harsh act of neglect or erasing the healthy desire you feel to live with integrity and care. True release is a softening of the muscles, a gradual widening of the chest that allows the heavy measurement tools of the mind to drop from your fingers without your constant management. It is the courage to see that the unpredictable texture of your unmapped journey is not a proof of your failure, but simply the raw ground where the natural clarity of life can find its peace. By letting that constant filtering drop, you are not losing your protection. You are simply reclaiming the living tissue of the moment you are actually inhabiting. You are allowing the space inside your lungs to be fresh and clean, instead of using all your time to manipulate an old ash bed that was already trying to find its balance at its own natural pace. Compassion begins when you look at your own racing thoughts and realize that your spirit has already survived many heavy fires. The ledges of your capacity are already set, they are already deep, and they have sustained you all the way to this quiet evening without letting your core identity completely vanish in the smoke. To continue tightening those leather straps tonight, for failing to match an artificial standard of resolution, is to force your own living mind to stand forever in the dark ruins of an unchosen year, while the rest of the world rests in the quiet. You can choose to leave the willow basket in the grass, allowing the uneven landscape to rest in the dark without demanding that it prove its justice tonight. You can offer those old self-corrections a quiet place in the damp earth, letting the ground hold the weight naturally. In a few moments, the keeper of the hearth will show us another way to sit with the green wooden tongs, where the mind must learn to hold the heat loosely before the heart can ever find its true release in the forest. But right now, let this emotional truth sink deep into the small muscles behind your eyes, down into the spaces between your ribs where you have stored your oldest anxiety. You are not required to produce a perfect apology from your past to be worthy of your own kindness tonight, and you do not need to guarantee a complete resolution to deserve a night of deep rest. The earth requires no permission to remain silent in the dark, and it does not spend its nights wishing it could turn its charred roots into a smooth road to look like a garden of accomplishments. It simply holds its inner stillness, completely free of the need to burn. Let yourself rest in the quiet space that notices how tired you have become from this long carrying of your own grievances. You can feel the soft texture of your current surroundings, the actual air moving across your face, the real support of the floorboards beneath your frame. These things are present and real, while the old emotional obligation is entirely unformed, existing now only as patterns of thought that cannot offer you any true shelter for the night. You are allowed to let the heavy leather straps drop onto the quiet stones, watching the white smoke of your self-monitoring settle to the ground until the whole mind becomes still and spacious, showing you nothing but your own undisturbed nature looking back at you from the dark. Let us take a quiet moment to pause right here, allowing the crisp, penescented moisture of the high forest to settle softly around the space where you are resting. There is absolutely no requirement to arrive at any sudden conclusion tonight, and no pressure is being placed upon your mind to prove its case or resolve an ancient conflict before the morning comes. If it feels right, allow your awareness to move gently toward the natural, unforced movement of your breath, just as it is occurring in this exact second. You do not need to alter its rhythm, and you do not need to make it conform to any idealized standard of perfect alignment. Simply observe the cool sensation of the air as it touches your nostrils, and follow the soft collapse of your abdomen as that breath returns to the room. With each exhalation, perhaps you might permit your jaw, your neck, and your upper shoulder blades to sink just a fraction deeper into the surface beneath you, letting the mattress absorb the full physical reality of your frame. As you lie here in the dark, you might become aware of a specific word left unsaid, an unreleased grievance, or a chronic habit of silent litigation that has been circulating through your thoughts tonight. Instead of trying to push this protective urge away, or forcing yourself to stop feeling angry about how you were treated, see if you can simply give it permission to be observed. You might imagine that this persistent need to guard your injury is like a small, tightly woven willow basket of active embers, strapped flat against your chest, its dry heat creating a subtle friction inside your awareness. There is no need to judge yourself for holding on to this protection, because it makes complete sense that you would try to secure your dignity by maintaining a meticulous record of your hurt. Even noticing that your muscles are braced against the possibility of being dismissed is enough, a soft, compassionate recognition that requires no struggle and no sudden transformation. Perhaps you can look directly at the emotional texture of this habit, naming the pattern quietly inside your own understanding without any blame. You might whisper to yourself softly, "This is the old habit of burning." Notice where this persistent weariness is expressing itself in your physical body right now, perhaps as a dry restriction across your lower teeth or a subtle, hot holding in the muscles of your diaphragm. If it feels comfortable, imagine mentally allowing the heavy leather straps of that embers basket to loosen and slip slowly away, letting the overcrowded arguments slide away from your focus without any effort from your fingers. You are not abandoning your integrity or pretending that the harm did not happen. You are simply giving your chest permission to loosen completely into the dark, letting the hearth floor rest without your active management. With your mind's eye, visualize that specific worry, that stiff line of chronic hypervigilance, being received by the deep bed of damp forest moss. You do not need to force an immediate healing. You only need to let the image change at its own speed. Watch as the mental representation naturally begins to alter, the sharp, red glow of the coals losing its intensity as it blends into the cool, dark moisture of the surrounding soil. Let the visualization move without any effort from your side, watching the wide clearing absorb the full density of your projections until the internal atmosphere feels completely uniform, calm, and safe. There is complete safety in allowing this inner practice to dissolve into the deep quiet of the room, knowing that you can return to your daily life whenever you are ready. For right now, in this unhurried interval, Your only requirement is to return to the simple physical surface of your bed. Notice the clean texture of the sheet against your wrists, the cool temperature of the air touching your skin, and the steady automatic rise and fall of your chest. You do not have to finish the architecture of your entire defense before the dawn arrives, and you do not need to achieve a state of absolute vindication tonight. The embers are out, the wood smoke has cleared, and your ribs can expand in the dark without any supervision from your tired thoughts, as you allow your presence to sink fully into the ground beneath you. As your frame continues to find its natural weight against the bed, perhaps you can perceive how the simple presence of the split oak tongs represents an entirely different way of moving through your dark hours. They do not try to change the temperature of the charcoal or grind away its natural substance. They simply move the material from one position to another because they hold things loosely and let them go immediately. They perform their task by meeting the element exactly as it is, requiring no permanent heat to clear the path. You can allow your awareness to rest in that same simple space of immediate reality tonight, choosing not to add another layer of dry wood to the arguments you wish you could win. Even noticing that your mind wants to reach for the leather straps is enough, a gentle observation that requires no judgment and no force. You can let your thoughts rest on the dry, soothing texture of the forest gravel that seems to fill the quiet spaces of your mind, a clean and grounded imagery that brings no demands and no parameters. You are not required to guarantee the absolute justice of your life or balance the ledger of your relationships before you are permitted to close your eyes. The mountain mist is passing outside the cabin without any assistance from your vigilance, and the cold ash is holding its position without asking for a single explanation to justify its existence. You are completely permitted to let your boundaries go slack, watching the old habits of containment lose their density until there is nothing left but the quiet, rhythmic expansion of your breath holding you safe in the dark. The cool, steady downpour of the late autumn rain began to stream through the highest branches of the mountain hemlocks, pooling in the small hollows of the black soil until the entire clearing smelled of wet bark and deeply cooled earth. Taran sat beneath the overhanging eaves of the low wood shelter, his hands resting loosely on his knees, watching the thin gray trails of moisture slide down the stone face of the dead hearth pit. Across from him, the master ash shifter was quietly working with her split oak tongs, using the green wood to lift pieces of cold, wet charcoal from a basket, sorting them by size onto a flat slab of granite without a single sound. She did not provide him with a simple verbal formula to erase the memory of the village council's mistake, and she did not promise that the elders would ever return to offer him the validation he had spent seasons craving. She merely reached down into a low tray of fine gray ash, allowed the soft dust to slip between her bare fingers, and turned her gaze toward the dark, misty path that led down to the valley outposts. As the evening deepened into a heavy, silent density, a young boy from the eastern logging camp scrambled up the slick mud path, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he fell against the timber frame of the doorway. He carried a message from one of the very elders who had signed Taran's unfair banishment, explaining that a sudden rockslide down the western ridge had buried the old man's winter storage bins, leaving his family stranded in the cold without dry kindling or shelter. Taran felt an immediate searing wave of heat rush directly behind his breastbone, his jaw locking instantly as his mind began to replay the exact words of the original betrayal with a fierce, burning velocity. The temptation to refuse the request was immense, a hot and righteous justification that told him this misfortune was a perfect, deserved punishment for the old man's past cruelty. He reached his hand inside his tunic, his fingers automatically tightening around the scorched wicker of his ember-basket, using the burning heat against his ribs to reinforce his right to remain distant and cold. He looked over at the ash shifter, who had not even altered the pace of her work, her gray palms continuing to handle the wet, unlit charcoal with a quiet, undisturbed precision that seemed to ignore the entire emergency. She did not command Taran to show mercy, and she did not pretend that the elders' past actions were acceptable or fair. She simply laid the split oak tongs flat across the stone table between them. Taran took a long, unhurried breath of the rain-cooled air, noticing for the first time how the green wood of the tool remained completely uncharred, precisely because it did not try to absorb the fire or fight the nature of the coal. It held what was hot without becoming hot itself, letting the element pass through its grip without altering its own organic structure. Instead of jumping to his feet to deliver a bitter refusal, or using his anger to build a higher wall between himself and the valley, Taran chose to sit perfectly still on the cedar bench, allowing the raw, painful reality of the boy's message to exist in his awareness without trying to shape it. For several minutes, his chest felt like an absolute furnace, as his racing thoughts tried to convince him that dropping his grudge would mean erasing his own dignity. He looked at the old woman working in the dim light of the tallow candle, and instead of treating his burning resentment as an undeniable truth that had to be obeyed, he unbuckled the heavy leather straps beneath his tunic, lifted the smoking willow basket away from his skin, and placed it down on the wet stones near the threshold. This single act of discipline did not automatically heal his blisters or make him feel a sudden wave of affection for his enemies, but it allowed his ribs to expand freely for the first time in many seasons. A quiet, spacious realization began to settle into the small muscles around his diaphragm, dissolving the tight restriction that had kept his breath shallow since the fire occurred. He saw that his ongoing effort to keep the evidence hot had never actually reached the valley elders or forced them to feel the weight of their mistake. It had only kept his own heart tied to the very disaster he claimed to despise. He looked at the small willow basket resting on the wet stone, its coals hissing softly as the falling rain touched the outer rim, and realized that his suffering was no longer being caused by the original injustice, but by his own daily refusal to let the hearth grow cold. He reached down, took a bundle of dry pine kindling from the corner of the room, and handed it to the waiting boy, choosing to assist the stranded family, not out of a forced pretense of forgiveness, but because he was finally ready to stop using his life force to guard an ancient flame. He did not become a magically perfect person in that moment, and he did not pretend that the past hurt had disappeared from his history. As he watched the boy disappear down the dark path with the wood, his chest still carried the raw scars where the hot wicker had pressed against his skin, and the memory of the elder's betrayal remained an undeniable fact of his journey. But as he sat back down near the cold hearth pit, he chose to let the remaining embers in his basket die down naturally into gray ash. Refusing to fan the sparks with any further silent arguments, he picked up the split oak tongs, held them loosely in his palm, and allowed his awareness to align completely with the vast, quiet pouring of the mountain rain. His spirit finally soft enough to receive the stillness of the forest without any more smoke to cloud his sight. The deliberate act of placing that smoking willow container onto the wet stone threshold reveals an incredible transformation in how we can treat our internal processing of past injuries during these quiet midnight hours. When we dissect the hidden engine of our late-night panic, we constantly find that we are treating our lives like an unpredictable mountain pass, trying to wrap every passing slight in thick, protective layers of strategic resentment so that we never have to face the sudden wind of a new betrayal. We live with an unspoken, heavy dread of what will happen if our current anger dissolves, leaving our hands empty and our personal dignity completely undefended against the world. This anticipatory grief drives us to endlessly project our worries forward or continuously replay our past missteps beneath the blankets, as if our mental tracing could somehow force the flowing world to harden into a permanent pavement before the sun rises. We believe that if we can just anticipate every possible error with enough intensity, we will finally earn the right to exist without fear. When you look closely at this habit of constant monitoring, you can see how easily the mind turns its natural fear of the unwritten into a permanent form of identity. You begin to define your very essence not as a living soul who is simply navigating a very complex, unwritten journey, but as a person whose baseline security is fundamentally fragile, because you cannot guarantee the justice of your choices. We try to correct this perceived emotional deficiency by using intense self-reproach and shame as our primary motivators, falsely believing that if we judge our current hesitation harshly enough, we will eventually force ourselves to become organized enough to conquer the wilderness. But self-judgment is a thick, cold frost that cannot bring any true stability to your core. It only keeps your attention locked onto the imaginary ruins of your own making. You become so accustomed to the familiar, tight band vibrating across your lower diaphragm that you begin to mistake that constant, draining vigilance for your actual name. The core insight of Buddhist wisdom draws a very sharp, very merciful distinction between the raw conditions that life naturally delivers and the extra suffering our mind constructs through its own desperate attempts at manipulation. Your journey through this world will always present you with certain unmapped transitions, sudden situational changes, moments of emotional emptiness, and intervals where your visible path feels entirely buried beneath a heavy drift of snow. This initial reality is like the crisp wind of the high crossroads touching an exposed face, a clean, inevitable friction that is simply a part of possessing an authentic, growing human life. But the mind, in its terror of making a mistake, immediately transforms that single foggy evening into an endless emergency. We add an immense secondary burden of stress by demanding that our horizon should be immediately transparent, or by convincing ourselves that we must completely exhaust our current vitality to force an unripened answer from the dark. Imagine a large weaving room where a craftsman prepares a fresh length of hemp yarn onto a wooden loom, intending to let the back and forth motion guide the material into a strong, simple cloth. The fibers can assume any beautiful form precisely because they remain pliable and soft, allowing the tension of the loom to shape its patterns without cracking the underlying threads. But if a frantic apprentice becomes terrified that the moving shuttle will stretch unevenly or develop a tiny knot on the frame, and he begins to throw heavy handfuls of dry salt and hard sand dust onto the cloth to force it to freeze perfectly straight, his desperate intervention only creates a gritty, brittle texture that collapses under its own friction. He ruins the natural potential of the material, not because his hands are malicious, but because his intense refusal to let the yarn remain flexible while it moves creates a breaking tension that tears the base. The spinning movement was never an enemy to the cloth. Your rigid, hypervigilant manipulation of the unripened thread is what creates the fracturing stress that disrupts your rest tonight. True peace does not mean that the unwritten chapters of your career, your relationships, or your health will suddenly display a permanent blueprint upon your wall, or that the world will completely change its rules to guarantee you a life without any wrong turns. Liberation arrives when you finally change your relationship with the unknown itself, allowing the vast container of your present awareness to hold the misty trail without letting that lack of data pull your physical body out of its natural alignment. You stop treating every anxious projection as a solid, undeniable reality that must be resolved from your mattress before you are permitted to close your eyes. When you notice a sharp, dense loop of planning arising behind your forehead, you can perceive it as nothing more than a single patch of smoke moving across a very broad frontier valley, a temporary cloud that will naturally spend its density if you simply keep your fingers loose, by letting go of the need to remain a permanent mapmaker over an unmanifested future. You are not committing an act of neglect against your practical life. You are simply recognizing that true security develops its strength deep within the step, entirely out of sight, and no amount of midnight grinding can assist the traveler in finding his path through the dark before he walks it. This internal transformation is incredibly subtle. It does not require a dramatic breakthrough or a complete rewriting of your practical goals. It is as simple as taking one single unhurried breath before you follow an old habit of self-reproach, noticing the familiar pull in your lower back, and deciding to let the wicker frames of your mind roll shut for the remainder of the evening. You are giving your spirit permission to inhabit the actual sanctuary where your spine is resting right now, instead of running back to the freezing ledges of an unchosen year. In a short while, we will explore how this deep way station wisdom can be carried out of the woods and into the specific daily patterns of your modern life. But for right now, let yourself sit with the immense relief that comes when you realize you do not have to finish the architecture of your entire 5-year strategy tonight. The world is turning without your supervision. The unplowed rows are holding their positions in the dark, and your value as a living soul requires no validation from a destination that was never meant to show itself in the dark. You are entirely permitted to let the muscles of your pelvis become soft and spacious, watching the old habits of prediction lose their grip until there is nothing left to hold onto but the simple, solid reality of this present hour. Let your awareness notice how the habit of self-judgment acts exactly like a layer of dry, hardened resin lining the inside of your ribs. We try to use this rigid casing to keep our feelings from shifting, believing that if we can create an absolute boundary against the unknown, our inner world will remain perfectly pristine and untouched by change. But the more we pack our true nature into these artificial compartments, the more we cut ourselves off from the natural warmth of the present moment. We become terrified of our own vulnerability, treating a single moment of sadness or uncertainty as a sign that our entire structure is collapsing into ruin. We forget that a living heart is meant to expand and contract, to feel the full texture of the passing seasons without becoming brittle or cold. When we allow ourselves to look at our anxiety through the simple clarity of the split oak tongs, we see that true durability comes from being pliable, not from being locked behind columns of mud. The wooden arms can execute a beautiful, clean alignment, precisely because they do not try to squeeze the entire length of the charcoal at once. They allow their tips to meet the single millimeter directly in front of their center. They hold the weight of the mountain winter not by fighting the gravity of the clearing, but by restricting their focus to the small circle of available light cast by the flame. Your spirit is fully capable of this same flexible endurance tonight. You do not need to turn your mind into a permanent blueprint to survive the transitions of your life. You can allow your awareness to become like that unpolished cedar counter, letting the warmth of the passing hours move through your center without leaving a single line of tension behind. Let the tight grip in your lower belly dissolve completely into the supportive surface beneath you, feeling how the mattress receives the full weight of your frame without asking for a single proof of your permanence. You do not have to settle the ultimate destination of your choices before your eyes close, and you do not need to find an accurate answer for every upcoming winter before the sun rises. The high mountain clearing is completely dark. The wild brush is resting in the damp mist, and the great canopy of the night is turning its uncounted stars without a single effort from your mind. You are completely permitted to let your boundaries go slack, watching the old habits of calculation lose their density until there is nothing left but the quiet, rhythmic expansion of your breath holding you safe in the dark. This high forest wisdom is never meant to stay locked away within the damp, soot-stained timber shelters of a charcoal clearing. It belongs directly in the middle of your modern, glass-paneled afternoons. We carry our unyieldingly hot ember baskets into crowded train cars, down brightly lit store aisles, and right into the tight silence that follows a sudden phone notification. Think of those specific moments during your week when you find your hand reaching out to tap a dark screen, checking over and over for some sign of reassurance or validation from an external source. In that small, high-tension interval, your inner life is acting exactly like an anxious forest worker in a dim hut, frantically stacking dry kindling to make sure your progress does not show a single day of weakness to the world. You are treating an unanswered message or an unreturned email like a major gap in your visible path, using up your precious current energy to force an immediate response from a landscape that may not even be settled. Consider how often you walk through your daily routines with an artificial expression of ease pinned to your features, while your deeper self is dragging a whole pile of unwritten worry through the office corridors. You pretend to have everything sorted because you worry that if anyone glimpses the raw, blistered skin on your knuckles, they will see that you are no longer executing the traditional confident posture your background demanded of you. We watch the beautifully filtered lives of our peers on social platforms, comparing our hidden, unpaved clearings with their visible lawns, instantly assuming that our own timeline is lagging behind a standard we never actually chose to carry. You feel an intense, crushing guilt whenever you try to sit loosely in a chair or lie down early on your mattress. Believing that your physical rest is a privilege you are only allowed to purchase after every single future variable has been fully countered. But this mountain sifter's wisdom offers an incredibly practical way to step away from the tools without needing to overturn your entire external environment. You can begin to express a quiet, spacious discipline right in the center of your kitchen or your desk, long before the sun goes down. When an old pattern of replaying a past mistake flashes across your awareness during a tensed conversation, or when a sudden fear of the future tightens your stomach, you can choose to introduce a brief, unhurried pause before your voice leaps out to defend itself. This pause is a deliberate untying of the basket straps, a moment where you look at the rigidity in your back and realize that this thought is just a passing cloud of gray smoke drifting through a wide valley. It does not mean your whole life is collapsing into ruin. You are choosing not to give your living hands to an old automated calculation, allowing the green oak tongs of your mind to focus entirely on the small circle of available light without your active management. You can hold a profound, beautiful devotion for the people who share your life without turning that care into a tight, strangling grip that tries to force their movements into a shape that feels safe to your anxiety. When we try to force a partner, a child, or a friend to match our internal map, we are simply trying to drop our own heavy, smoking twigs across their natural growth, an exhausting manipulation that leaves both people feeling raw and confined. True love acts more like that cool, wet forest clearing, remaining broad and steady, allowing the other person to develop at their own natural pace while you stay anchored in your own quiet depth. You do not need to wire their branches to make your own existence valid, because your capacity for awareness is already vast enough to contain whatever seasons move through the room. Allow your mind to absorb the liberating truth that you do not need to earn your right to lie perfectly still on this bed, and your worth as a living being is not dependent on how much of your future fortress you manage to force into place today. You can let your bones become heavy right now, simply because the dark has arrived and the floorboards beneath your room are entirely ready to sustain your weight without asking for a single proof of your invulnerability. You can let the unmapped paths go completely dark tonight, understanding that the only current that contains any genuine warmth, any real texture, or any real breath is the one passing through your lungs in this precise second. The tomorrow you are rehearsing is just an empty valley. Your anxiety is carving from dry soil, a pattern that carries no actual substance unless you choose to pull it over your chest before the day has even dawned. When you notice your attention creeping forward to predict an old disappointment or mourn a misstep you did not prevent, you can gently hold the movement without a single trace of anger or self-reproach. You might smile at how deeply your conditioning wants to protect you by dragging you back to the freezing battlements. And you can offer that anxious habit a moment of soft validation. You can say to your own heart, the heavy baskets have already been left on the damp path, the workspace is empty, and there is absolutely no debt left to pay in the middle of the night. Let the simple texture of the present environment settle into your awareness, noticing how the quietness of the hour fits perfectly around your frame. You do not need to resolve the dilemmas of your career or balance the ledger of your relationships before your eyes close. The dark air moving through the room requires no explanations from you, and it carries no memory of the errors you believe you made during the daylight hours. You are allowed to be an unfinished piece of work tonight, a living presence that is completely at ease with its own mysteries. The green wood handles have found their rest, the valley outposts are silent, and the space right beneath your lower spine is holding you with an absolute, unconditional strength that requires no effort from your mind to maintain. You can allow your consciousness to unhook itself from the need to be right, or the need to have the final word in an internal argument that has been running through your head since dinner. When we insist on winning these silent debates in the dark, we are merely polishing the edges of our calculations, trying to make our arguments look brilliant, so that no one can see how cold we have become underneath. You can let the argument remain completely unresolved, letting the words drop onto the floorboards like loose scrap paper that has no use in a room meant for sleeping. The people who misunderstood you are completely distant now, and your defense is no longer required to keep your true essence safe from their judgment. Let your ribs expand into the vast, quiet space of the mattress, feeling the organic warmth of your own center rising up to replace the cold density of the metal bindings you dropped. You are discovering that your life does not need to be a continuous combat mission against an unformed future. It can be a simple, light journey that flows around the obstacles just like the mountain stream. Every long breath you take is a clean release of the extra suffering you have been layering on top of your history. A gentle return to the unadorned simplicity of your own being. You are safe here, you are unguided, and you are entirely free to let the watchman's fire burn down to cold ash while you sink into the deep, restorative dark. The mountain forest has grown completely quiet now, and the persistent rain that streamed through the highest hemlock branches has dissolved into the deep, cooling moisture of the black soil. Let the language itself begin to loosen its grain, softening its pace until every single syllable lands, like a drop of cool morning dew settling onto the stone floor of the shelter. Your physical form is becoming immense and heavy, sinking down through the supportive layers of the bed as the fresh, damp presence of the clearing settles across the front of your body. The long seasonal watch over your internal perimeter has ended for the night, and the heavy willow basket has been left completely empty on the wet stone threshold. Far below the surface of your awareness, the acrid wood smoke is still, and your fingers have forgotten the permanent curl around the tight leather buckles. Listen to the quiet, automatic expansion of your abdomen, a soft wave of movement that requires no diagrams, no structural coordinates, and no checking from your intellect. With each long exhalation, the center of your ribs softens completely, letting go of the residual heat that has lived behind your sternum. Since your earliest memory of an unfair accusation, you are drifting back into the broad, unmapped space of your true nature, a clear, open landscape that is entirely capable of holding its own stillness without your active management. The rigid lines of your silent arguments have dissolved into the wet forest air, leaving nothing but the simple, unhurried density of your body resting against the mattress. There is no longer any temporary fire to tend before the light returns, and no upcoming path is asking to be defended in the quiet of this hour. The split oak tongs are resting quietly near the cold stones, undisturbed, unmarked, and completely whole in their simple surrender to the immediate circle of available light. Let your eyelids become twice as heavy as before, closing out the memory of the village council, closing out the search for a vindication that was never meant to define your capacity for peace. You are granted full permission to leave your unwritten chapters unmanaged tonight, to let the defensive machinery go entirely slack, without trying to settle a single account with your history. The valleys are sleeping perfectly well without your surveillance. The dark is cradling your shoulders without a single condition, and you are allowed to slip quietly beneath the weight of your self-protection. Allow your spirit to sink into the vast, undisturbed vacancy of a clearing that has no need for a fire to keep it safe. What if the cool, silent rain has already washed away the path you were fighting to prove? The echo of that question settles softly into the deep spaces of your room, losing its vibration as it sinks into the quiet surface of the mattress. There is no demand for an answer tonight, and no need to construct an explanation to carry across the threshold of your sleep. The vast, unmapped capacity of your mind already knows how to cradle this stillness without your active guidance. You can feel the physical reality of your body growing heavier and more anchored with each passing breath, as if the support beneath you were absorbing the very last traces of the day's calculations. Every tight cord across your ribs continues to uncoil. The shoulders spread a fraction wider against the sheets, and the muscles around your temples rest completely soft, freed from the exhaustion of a blueprint that was never real to begin with. Let the cool, damp presence of the mountain fog pass across your awareness, soothing the small channels that have spent hours tightly scanning the horizon for an upcoming danger. You are no longer standing at the literal crossroads, and you are no longer responsible for proving to the world that your timeline is perfectly straight. The travelers have all departed. The lamp trimmer has put away his oil cans, and the entire way station has been given over to the absolute, unconditional peace of the midnight hours. The cedar counter requires no further preparation. The dry horsehair brush has grown cold on its stone, and the long sheet of silk rests in the shadows, completely untouched by the anxieties of the day. Consider the immense patience of the deep valley trees, how they receive the changing seasons and the shifting clouds without ever needing to see the layout of the entire forest or justify their growth to the mountain. They do not spend their nights wishing they could freeze their leaves against the autumn frost, and they do not view an unmapped trail as an error in their environment. They simply stand in the dark, allowing the mist to form and the shadows to lengthen, holding their presence precisely because they do not fight the space they inhabit. Your awareness is permitted to be exactly like that quiet grove tonight, a wide, receptive sanctuary that can house the memory of your old hesitations without letting those memories shorten the natural movement of your chest. You are not lost in the fog. You are simply returning to the unformed depth that has always sustained your life. The faint, lingering strategies of the afternoon are nothing more than small specks of soot drifting lazily through the quiet air of the attic, catching a brief glint of the dying lamp flame before settling invisibly onto the floorboards. There is no requirement to reach out your hands to organize them, and there is no need to trace their paths back to the choices that made you feel stagnant. An unheld thought carries no weight in this room, and it has no power to tighten the muscles of your pelvis or restrict the flow of the air unless you choose to pick up the brush again. You can let them pass through the darkness of your awareness, watching them dissolve into the broad, quiet spaces of the ridge without giving them your current breath to keep the calculation alive. You are entering an interval where the pressure of progress has completely faded away, and the frantic ledgers of your daily routine have dissolved like water vapor over the mountain stream. The world around you is completely still, wrapped in a protective, heavy blanket of shadow that requires absolutely no monitoring or verification from your tired thoughts. Your consciousness is drifting back to its original home, to the uncarved, spacious clarity that existed long before you ever learned to fear an unchosen turn or treat your own internal pace as an emergency. This original baseline has never been altered by the variables you failed to predict. It has never been diminished by the paths that remained closed, and it is waiting right here, breathing softly beneath the surface of your frame. Allow yourself to drop completely into that soft velvet depth now, releasing the names of your mistakes, releasing the plans for tomorrow's confirmation, and letting go of the very need to hold an image of your destination together for the world tonight. The bed is supporting your spine with an absolute, unquestioning strength. The darkness is shielding you from the demands of the day, and your breath is moving through your body like a slow, unhurried tide on a completely silent shore. You can lay down the ledger of your self-improvement entirely, letting the vessel of your sleep drift out into the calm, open spaces, where there are no parameters to meet and no coordinates you need to verify before the morning breaks. Every channel in your stomach is clear. Every old restriction has been smoothed by the quiet, and your tired soul is finally permitted to sleep, resting whole, undisturbed, and beautifully complete in the deep current of this single living moment. The darkness deepens its hold around your shoulders, expanding into the spaces between each breath, as if the entire world has stepped back to give your mind a spacious arena to completely dissolve its calculations. You do not have to carry the weight of who you were during the daylight hours, or prepare an answer for the choices that will wait for you when the sun returns to the pass. The anticipation that wound through your forehead has found its level in the wide plains of your sleep, and all the heavy text your anxiety gathered along the trail has naturally dropped away, leaving the surface of your awareness perfectly clear and still. You are no longer navigating. You are no longer guarding an unpolished inner chamber. You are simply resting on the bank of the life you have survived. Let the weight of your eyelids double in their heaviness, releasing the very last trace of focus, letting the darkness behind your eyes become a soft, warm blanket that envelopes your thoughts. You can feel the quiet rhythm of the room, a gentle rise and fall that matches the unhurried expansion of your chest. The breath comes in as a quiet gift from the night air, cool and unburdened, and it flows out like a wide valley opening into the vastness of an unmapped ocean, where there are no currents to fight. There are no maps to maintain here, no brass tools to watch, and no debts to pay to the future. The measurement cords of the old guard duty have been uncoiled so completely that your pelvis can finally rest flat against the support beneath you, sinking down into absolute peace. The small, lingering ripples of prediction that occasionally cross your awareness are no longer demands that you must obey. They are merely distant sounds, like the faint crackle of a cooling wick in a deep oil lamp, echoing softly and then dissolving back into the absolute silence of the cedar walls. You can watch them appear and disappear without reaching out your hands to catch them, knowing that an unheld thought has no power to pull you out of the sanctuary of this room. The mind has finally grown tired of its own long defensive game, and it is ready to let the iron shears rest at the bottom of the quiet workshop dust. You are entering a deep, restorative sleep where time has no numbers and the future has no shape. The way station is peaceful, the great mountain ridges are silent, and the space right beneath your lower back is holding you with an absolute, unconditional strength that requires no effort from your mind to maintain. Every single thing you have ever anticipated has rested its arms. Every hollow chamber is clear, and your tired soul is finally allowed to sleep, peaceful, whole, and completely free in the deep current of this single living moment.